I don't want no oil, a spoil in my shoreline. I like fish much better than crud. I like birds and things, a-creeping and crawling. Won't trade no more oil for blood. The sun done give us all we need to make this country run. But that black demon oil's got us fussing and fighting, and I do believe it's time we was done. I don't want them nukes run by them kooks who think radioactivity is fun. No more three-headed frogs or kids with leukemia. Nuclear power ain't fit for a dog. The sun done give us all we need to make this country run. But that nuclear power's got us fussing and fighting, and I do believe it's time we was done. No nukes!
Good morning, Toledo, and good afternoon, Columbus, and hello to everyone in Bowling Green or listening on the internet, wherever or whenever you may be. My name is Joseph D. DeMar, and I'm here with my ever-curious co-host,
Rebecca Wood. And I'm wondering if you mean curious as in wants to know things or curious as in just plain odd. Either one kind of fits.
whichever one you'd like.
Okay.
For the next hour, we're going to be looking at a variety of ecological issues on our program For a Green Future. For a Green Future is a show where we talk about ecology and the environment. And we talk about them in the ways that they affect you, your wealth, your health, your happiness, and the wealth and health and happiness of your friends and family. And the health and happiness of the primary producers, like bacteria and algae, the primary consumers, like grazing animals or zooplankton, the predators, like dragonflies and wolves, or the decomposers, like vultures and fungi, because no matter where you are on the food chain, we're all sitting at the same amazing buffet table called Earth. For the next little while, we're going to talk about some ecological observations and do a little pontificating about an important Supreme Court decision coming up that could effectively eliminate environmental laws once and for all. We don't have a guest interview this week. Our producer, he who must not be named, is very busy doing something which we cannot discuss. And while we have some interview requests pending, none of them came together in time to record this show. Of course, last week we had 2 interviews, so it kind of balances out. Just a final reminder about one of those interviews we had with Stephanie C. of Roam Free Nation. You still have a few more days until October 10th to submit your comments on the Yellowstone Bison Management Plan. Go to our podcast or YouTube video of last week's episode to find out more. So, instead of a guest this week, we're going to take a close look at an ecological principle, as we do from time to time. This time we're going to be discussing predators and predation. That's a topic that's sure to get your adrenaline flowing. We'll look at the role of predators in a healthy ecosystem and why it's so unnatural to have the lions lying down with the lambs. After that, we'll be hearing from our sponsors and patrons. Also this week, we have a special announcement just for our Bowling Green listeners. Then it'll be time for Rebecca to take the mic. Rebecca, what will you be talking to us about this week?
I'll be talking about some recent expulsions of non-natives from the Brazilian Amazon.
Amazon. That
Yes.
sounds steamy.
Yes, it is. It's pretty steamy.
After we hear from Rebecca, it's ecological news from around the world. We've got some good news about the rise of solar energy in the U.S. Also, there's new research linking radiation exposure to even more diseases than you'd expect. We've long known that it causes cancer and heart disease. Well, there's a new, serious, and unexpected disease that has been linked to radiation exposure from the emergency workers at Fukushima. This is a pre-recorded show, recorded on Thursday, October 5th. So you won't be able to call in live, but you can call or text 419-973-5841 or send an email to foragreenfutureradio@gmail.com. We always love to hear from you. So now it's time for our weekly update on the Canadian wildfires. This data is as of September 29th. Unfortunately, very bad news this week. The number of fires has surged 50% from only 600 to 1,018. Out-of-control fires have more than doubled from 229 to 488. More than 250,000 people have had to evacuate over this season, and there have been 6 confirmed deaths. About 17.9 million hectares have burned. That's an area just about the size of the state of Missouri, and that total is more than 6.5 times the area burned in an average fire season. With this surge in fires came a surge in smoke. The entire Northeast has been blanketed in smoke for the past week. Smoke's actually reached all the way down to Miami, Florida. The fires that are burning in Canada right now are part of the circumpolar arboreal forest, which up until now has been one of the biggest carbon sinks on the planet. This year, Canada has changed from a net carbon absorber to a net carbon producer, as thousands of years of that plant growth has gotten changed into CO2 from the fires. It's clear that we need massive change right now, and there are encouraging signs that things are beginning to change. Almost every time one goes out on the road now, you can see electric cars like Teslas and plug-in hybrids like the Chrysler Pacifica. But it's also clear that, more than just individual actions, we need new regulations from the government. Unfortunately, there's a case before the Supreme Court right now that may eliminate government agencies' ability to make or enforce rules. Way back in 1984, there was a unanimous decision by the Supreme Court in a case called Chevron USA Inc. versus the Natural Resources Defense Council. Ironically, Chevron, as the case is called, was seen as a loss for environmentalists at the time. But over time, it's evolved and proven to be absolutely vital for protecting Americans' health, safety, and environment. Chevron is an oil company, and its refineries are poisoning the planet. Back in 1984, the NRDC brought Chevron to court because the company was violating the Clean Air Act by allowing too much pollution into the environment. The NRDC was trying to force the EPA to enforce the Clean Air Act. However, at that time, the EPA was under Ronald Reagan, and Reagan never met a pollutant he didn't like. The Clean Air Act had some ambiguities to it. The law itself doesn't spell out exact parts per million or exact measurement methods for every single pollutant. If it did, it would have taken decades to write and compile. The EPA under Ronald Reagan argued that statutory ambiguity existed. That's where there could be more than one interpretation of the law, the regulatory agency should get to interpret how the law is to be applied. The Supreme Court at that time agreed. In that case, the EPA's...
I thought the courts were supposed to decide how a law could and couldn't be applied.
That is the case, yeah. If they had ruled the other way, then the courts would decide each individual issue that was brought up before it.
Okie dokie.
Right. The EPA's interpretation at that time was to let the pollution flow. But since then, Chevron Defense, as it's been called, has been used by all federal agencies whenever the need for interpreting a law is written. The fundamental idea is that the scientists and experts at the federal agencies are better at making those decisions than federal judges, who often have no training at all in the area being regulated. The EPA, the Food and Drug Administration, and many other organizations depend on it for almost all their rulemaking. There's 2 simple tests to Chevron deference. First, the law is examined to see if Congress's intent is clear. If so, then that intention must be followed to the letter. But if it's vague, again, if it can be interpreted and followed in a couple different ways, then the federal agency gets to decide how to interpret it. That brings us to today, where the Supreme Court has decided to take up a case called Loper Bright Enterprises v. Raimundo. In this case, the fishing company, Loper Bright Enterprises, is suing the National Marine Fisheries Service. The NMFS, using Chevron, has set limits on the number of fish that can be caught each season in order to prevent the collapse of fisheries. Often it sets those numbers too high and overfishing damages fisheries, but at least it is setting some limits, and it has prevented many fish species along the U.S. coasts from being fished all the way to extinction. Part of the way it enforces the limits is that fishing boats are required to carry government-appointed inspectors at a cost of $700 per day. The company claims, the lawsuit is about, that the NMFS has no authority to force them to have inspectors on board or to pay for them. The problem is that authority depends on Chevron deference. By challenging that specific issue, the entire regulatory structure of the federal government is at risk. It's almost certain how the current insanely conservative court is going to rule. But ironically, by ruling in the fishing company's favor, the court is guaranteeing a fishery collapse within a few years that will almost certainly bankrupt Loper Bright Enterprises.
Does that include like very small fishing boats, or it's just like the really big trawlers?
Yes, that $700 a day inspector is for all commercial fishing boats, small or large. The people, the corporations backing Loper, though, include hundreds of other industries that chafe under federal regulations covering things like workers' safety or food safety. This Chevron deference is responsible for example, the limitation of the number of cockroach parts in cans of beef stew or peanut butter, the requirement that workers in high places have to use safety harnesses, that's also Chevron. All those safety measures, all the regulations that have happened over the last 30 years, all that will be wiped out in this one sweeping decision, which will mean billions more in profits for the biggest companies and death, sickness, and crappy food and products for us.
Oy vey.
There's also an ethical footnote to this controversy. Clarence Thomas, who's currently under fire for accepting billions of dollars worth of gifts from billionaires who had cases before the court, is up to his eyeballs behind this one.
How come nobody ever gives me millions of dollars in gifts?
If only,
I'm a
if
nice
only
person.
we could, a lifetime,
And it's just gifts, you know. He just has generous friends. That's all. I just want to meet them. That's what I'm saying.
a lifetime appointment to a court position. Yeah.
Right.
Loper's attorneys are linked to the Koch network, and Clarence Thomas regularly took part in donor retreats for the millionaires and billionaires as they raised money to bring the court case to court. In other words, Clarence Thomas helped raise funds for the people who want him to overturn Chevron. This would be kind of like if the judge in a murder case was also the coroner. 50 House Democrats called on Thomas to recuse himself on September 27th. So far, he's refused, surprising no one. It looks like he's going to rule in his buddy's favor. Corruption seems like too weak a word to describe what's happening here. As we say each week at the start of our show, we bring you the information that could impact your wealth, health, and happiness. This upcoming court decision threatens all three. Your wealth would be affected directly as regulations on banks and insurance companies are rolled back. Your health would suffer as food and drug quality plunges, and it's hard to be happy when you're broke and sick, and the air is too dirty to breathe, and the water too dirty to drink, and you can't even get a decent fish fry these days.
All conditions which I have experienced in Toledo, except for I don't like fish, so an absence of fish fries is not a problem for me.
Well, the billionaires who benefit from this rule change don't eat the same food as we do anyways. They've got private chefs. They don't use the same banks or credit unions that we do. They use banks reserved for the ultra-wealthy, it almost seems like there are different species of human. Somehow, as they get richer, the rest of us get poorer. They've often been compared to economic predators. So let's take a look at real predators and their role in ecology. Predators have been around for a very long time. Put simply, predation, as defined by Wikipedia, is the biological interaction where one organism, the predator, kills and eats another organism, its prey. The first fossil multicellular organism we've discovered that was definitely a predator is 560 million years old. Interestingly, it's named after the famous naturalist David Attenborough. It's called Aurora lumina attenboroughi. Doesn't look like much. It certainly doesn't make you think of fangs and claws the way predators, modern day predators do. It was a couple of tubes with cup shapes at the end, and those cups held a bunch of tentacles that caught its prey, kind of like a sea anemone today. It lived during the Ediacaran era, which is a fascinating time of the Earth's history that's not really well studied. The Ediacaran era started before the great oxygenation event that changed the Earth's atmosphere to closer to what it is today. During that time, multicellular life really kind of got its act together, developing into big animals that had things, exciting new biological things like circuitry systems and muscles. So the role of a predator showed up pretty soon after multicellular organisms got started. Of course, even before that, the Earth spent billions of years teeming with life made up of single-celled organisms. The first organisms, the prokaryotes, as far as we know, didn't have predators specifically. Everybody just got along photosynthesizing or chemosynthesizing, and generally just growing and dividing using the energy and chemicals around them. This happy cooperative time started about 3.7 billion years ago and continued for about 1 billion years until the eukaryotes arrived. When the eukaryotes arrived, showed up, evolved, they just started eating everybody. The eukaryotes are single-celled organisms with nuclei like amoeba. They
How
can just
rude.
They did not catch the vibe. No. They were evolved to engulf and just absorb smaller organisms. There's also microscopic predators like Paramecium that can sweep other organisms that like bacteria or algae into their mouths, quote unquote, and digest them. Predation as a process has all kinds of advantages. It takes a lot of work and energy to turn simple molecules in the environment like CO2 and nitrogen into complicated molecules like proteins and DNA. If you're a predator, you can simply take the proteins and fats and other complicated molecules that other organisms have put in all the work creating and use them in your own cells for a fraction of the effort. This is as true for amoeba as it is for killer whales. Being able to build more body with less effort makes it easier to get larger. Usually, predators are bigger than their prey. This helps with overpowering them. Of course, some prey animals, like blue whales, use the strategy of becoming too big to be eaten, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. So about 1 billion years of peace, love, and happiness among the single-celled organisms, and then 2 billion years or so of single-celled mayhem as organisms started eating each other left and right. But then multicellular organisms arrived. Now, the first multicellular organisms seem to be photosynthetic. It's possible they may have evolved that way partly to protect themselves from the single-celled predators like amoeba. The first multicellular fossils are about 30 centimeters long, about 1,000 times the size of a paramecium, way too big to eat. Predation driving evolution is a theme that has been part of what has shaped life and our planet ever since the eukaryotes showed up. So many predators and prey are locked into evolutionary arms races. That is,
I read this article once. It was in some travel magazine in, I don't know, Missouri. But there was this one family that had like 3 kids with this disorder where they were essentially allergic to food.
Allergic
And
to food.
they couldn't have anything but Ensure shaved ice. And I guess the reason for this that they said is that all plants have irritants. Essentially, all plants are actually poisonous because they, when things started to eat them, they were like, okay, well, if we develop this poisonous irritant, then they won't do that. But then the predators or the things eating the grass developed resistance to that. And essentially, like these kids just didn't have that gene. No, they were. That's why they were allergic to everything.
Wow.
Because all plants are actually sort of a little poisonous.
Right. So that's an example of the prey species, the plant, using a strategy to escape being eaten.
Yeah.
That's similar to the evolutionary arms race. I guess the kids there lost that arms race.
I don't know. They were they were like 10 or 11 or 12 or something.
Yeah,
by
probably
the
not
time.
their fault.
So yeah,
but-
I hope they're still doing good.
Another example of a evolutionary arms race strategy is speed in a population of prey animals. Let's look at impala, from Africa. Being the fastest in the herd definitely gives you an advantage when you're being chased by a cheetah. But so the impala that have some kind of advantage are more likely to go on to have offspring. So each generation could get faster than the one before. But the thing is, the predators can also evolve so that they can catch the prey. Cheetahs got to eat, The predator and prey can spiral into an evolutionary arms race that can get to ridiculous lengths. The cheetah is probably the fastest land animal ever to have lived on the earth, and not much else. Doesn't do much else. The blue whale is the biggest. We see these evolutionary arms races over and over. Some animals might develop resistance to venom. Others develop protective shells or camouflage defenses. So predators, the existence of predators definitely has an effect on the prey that it hunts. But do ecosystems really need them? Can't we go back to those early peaceful prokaryote days, but with multicellular organisms instead? If a lamb and a lion really love each other, is that so wrong?
What you're telling me is the original Garden of Eden was actually just kind of like a big pot of soup. It was gazpacho, right?
With every
Yeah.
tree being a single being.
Right.
Well, to answer the whole question, you'll need to look at the whole picture. Prey species have to eat too, or most of the time. Usually they eat primary producers. So predators keep prey species numbers low enough so that they don't eat themselves out of house and home. Also, predators affect prey behavior in many different ways that benefit an ecosystem. Deer, for example, will limit their grazing times to dawn and dusk if there's predators about. They're naturally crepuscular. But if there's no predators, eventually those prey animals will start moving into the daylight hours. Studies in Africa, in areas where the lions have been exterminated, indicate normally timid prey basically just stand around all day eating, and they then overgraze. That can follow population crashes as the hungry, sick prey species have more and more trouble finding enough healthy food to maintain themselves. This process, the idea of a healthy ecosystem, is very hard for some people to accept. Even today, you see misguided bumper stickers like, "Save an elk, shoot a wolf." The thing is, with predators, you can actually have more healthier prey animals because the predators generally target the sick and the weak.
This is what Farley Mowat said in Never Cry Wolf, which is a book I'm a little obsessed with. But he noticed, he was out there on the behest of the Canadian government observing the wolves, and he noticed that they would kind of like run at fawns and then just let the fawn get away, or caribou fawns, and then just let it get away, like, haha, just kidding. But they were testing them. They were testing them because they really only eat the sickly fawns. And then he had to do an experiment. They had to do an experiment to prove that a large animal could eat just on primarily rodents, which was his theory of what the wolves were actually doing, with only like occasional caribou to supplement their diet when they found a
Sure.
real weak or sickly one. And then some of his Eskimo friends, his Inuit friends, came over and saw him cooking mice, and they never came over to dinner again because they thought there's something just badly wrong with this guy, you know.
It's for science,
Yeah,
though. They
right,
didn't know.
yeah.
Well, being a predator is kind of like cheating, biologically speaking, because you're getting what you need to survive from other animals.
Very true.
Cheaters are generally lazy and don't waste energy hunting healthy prey. But here's the thing about human billionaires. Predators do have to expend some energy to hunt to get their energy back from the prey animals. But billionaires don't spend money to make money. They attach themselves to existing powerful figures and then spend money on themselves while attracting more powerful figures all the while. In other words, once they're attached to something, they suck energy out of the system of which they're a part. Billionaires are parasites that have received a beneficial position due to the actions of others, and now they spend all of their time reducing others to the least they can be. There are no exceptions to this. You might be able to make an argument for an ethical millionaire, but any entity that has had to accumulate such a staggering amount of wealth or energy from a system necessarily has to trod on others to leave them in the dust behind. So let's hear it for the real predators: the wolves, bears, lions, killer whales, sharks and spiders, snakes and all those other critters, doing their best to keep the ecosystem in balance. That's one huge way that predators, real predators, are different from human billionaires. All right, thanks for listening to that special on predators. Let's get back to our regular schedule. Let's hear from our patrons and sponsors.
For a Green Future is also brought to you by the Wood County Park District. The Wood County Park District is a natural resources conservation agency. They protect natural spaces, maintain quality green spaces, provide engaging programming, and they teach people to love and respect nature. They also restore wildlife habitats and lead people on outdoor adventures. Wood County Parks protects natural spaces in Wood County for all to enjoy from 8 a.m. to 30 minutes past sunset every day of the year. There are several ways to get a hold of them and find out what's happening. One is to call them at 419-353-1897. Another is to visit their website, www.wcparks.org. The website again is www.wcparks.org. They are also available on all social media: Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and many others. Just search for WC Parks. That's the Wood County Park District, and we're very grateful for their support.
For a Green Future is also brought to you by our patrons. These are people who have gone to patreon.com, patreon.com, and searched for a Green Future. There they signed up to have a small donation come out of their accounts every month. We thank our patrons because without them, we couldn't do this show. Thanks for listening to those messages. Well, Rebecca, are there any predators in the Amazon rainforest?
A few, yeah. But let's see. First, I wanted to mention that in honor of Indigenous Peoples Day, which is coming up this weekend, I want to talk about the fact that Brazil is expelling people from traditional native territory now, non-natives. According to the AP article from the 2nd of October by Mauricio Savarese, people are being expelled from the Apitarewa and Trincheira Bacaha territories in Para state of Brazil, which is traditionally occupied by the Arawate and the Assurine people, who are both from the Xingu over tribe or larger ethnic group and are closely related cultures, I guess, and have both historically lived along the Xingu River in the Amazon rainforest. This started on Monday, and they're taking a stance against illegal immigrants who are mostly gold miners and cattle ranchers, and amount to 1,600 families have been evicted.
That were indigenous or
No,
were
no, no.
immigrants?
The immigrants.
Oh,
yeah,
okay.
the gold miners and ranchers and so forth. But yeah, the Apachurewa territory had the most deforestation up to this point of any indigenous land in Brazil, and the federal police and armed forces are participating in trying to correct that, apparently. And this is all at the behest of President Luis Ignacio Lula da Silva, who also has expelled thousands of gold miners from the Yanomami territory. Yanomami, not that hard, Becca, in the Roraima region. It's been bolstered. The decision's been bolstered by recent top court rulings denying a suit by farmers against the indigenous groups trying to expand their territorial claims. So yeah, I looked into the Arawate a little bit, or Arewete. It's I've seen it spelled with an E or an A in the same article, actually. So they are Swidden agriculturalists, which is what we learned in school in the 70s to call slash and burn agriculture or shifting field cultivation. Basically, you cut down trees and plants right before the rainy season, burn them to enhance the soil and also eliminate weeds and pests. So it's kind of just one step for everything.
Wow.
Very handy. And then about every 3 to 5 years, the soil gets depleted and you move on instead of just continuing until the soil is gone and it turns into a desert. Because this is the thing about the Amazon. I remember this from college. It's very, very fertile, but most of the nutrients are in the trees. So when you cut them down, you get this crappy soil, crappy clay soil that's kind of useless and is only good for a couple years afterwards.
It's like a terrarium. Everything's self-enclosed until you break it out.
Yeah, basically. So yeah, the Arawate live on the Igarape Ipixuna River, which is a tributary of the Xingu. They have one large village, actually. They may be a remnant of the Pakaha people who moved into the rainforest to flee missionaries, which, if you've ever had people knock on your door, you can probably understand that you want to go all cottagecore and move to the Amazon. Just for a minute, you have that impulse, As of 1950, they were living at the headwaters of the Bakaha River, but they were pushed out by somebody called the Kayapo Kirin, or Xirin, moved to the Xingu River, displacing the Asurini and change. And they first encountered Westerners in the 1960s, fur traders who were hunting big cats mostly. They got along with those guys pretty well, traded for iron tools. But there was friction with the Paracana peoples, forced them to move again. And then when the Trans-Amazonian Highway came in the 1970s, they had a lot of problems with disease and more clashes with other local tribes, and they were forcibly relocated in march through the jungle, resulting in 30 deaths. So it was kind of their only little miniature trail of tears, apparently. Well, at least it wasn't in the winter. And they like to mostly grow maize. So according to Povos Indígenas Brasil website, there's 460 members of this tribe. They call them something like the Baide. It's like a B-I-D-E, only it's a weird little umlaut mark over the I. And they live in liana forests, which have a lot of vines and spiny cacti and rocky outcroppings. So slightly tricky to navigate, but pretty good for evading missionaries. Nobody wants to go in there.
Yeah, I guess it's important to remember that we hear a lot about the large-scale Amazonian, deforesting or what have you down there, but this kind of thing is happening on a much smaller scale also. There's individual gold miners that just want to make a living for themselves, but added up to 1,600 families that can take a toll.
Yeah. So, people are just trying to survive, but how you do it is important, how you go about it. And another thing, speaking of predators that they have in that area, with some of those big cats that I was talking about, are jaguars. According to the World Wildlife Fund, they're called Panthera onca, O-N-C-A, Panthera onca. They're the largest cat species in the Americas. third largest in the world. The main predators of the Amazon control species population. So, like we were saying,
Predation, yeah.
yeah, and their range has decreased by half in the last 100 years, which is bad due to deforestation and agriculture. Also being affected by hunting, habitat destruction, loss of prey species, and conflict with humans. So it used to be pelt hunting was a problem, but that was outlawed in the 1970s. They live primarily in forests and grasslands, and their status is near threatened. They can get up to be 6 feet long. Their name is Jaguarete. It's from the native word Jaguarete. Yeah. Fierce beast, he who kills in one leap.
That's a good name.
Yeah.
Very romantic.
It does. Yeah, it sounds like the hunters who named them kind of admired them for that,
Yeah.
you know. And that's a word in the Tupi and Guarani languages. And they can weigh over 300 pounds. Wow. Central American jaguars are a little bit smaller, but they live basically in the Amazon, Central America, and something called the Pantanal, which I'd never heard of. The Pantanal, it turns out, is a 5,400 plus square mile swamp. It's flooded grasslands in Bolivia, and Paraguay.
Is that still part of the rainforest? Or
I don't think it is.
Paraguay?
I think it's a
No,
separate
yeah.
ecosystem. Because they mentioned it, you know, those being the three places, basically.
Yeah.
Oh, there's rainforest in Central America, so that overlaps. But yeah, also some other cats they share the Amazon rainforest would be puma, jaguarundi, and ocelots. And half of all jaguars live in Brazil. The rest are divided among 17 other countries.
wow,
Yeah.
amazing.
Who knew? Not me. I've never heard of the Pantanal, for starters.
Not part of now, no. Well, now it's time to turn for international news. A pleasant first story comes to us from Rosie Frost at Euronews.com. Ireland's wind generation has exceeded demand for electricity for the first time ever. This event happened Tuesday, September 26th, partially due to the strong winds from Storm Agnes. This is just the crest of a wind power wave that's been riding high all summer. This last July and August also both had record-breaking levels of electricity generation, increasing by 70% over the previous year. The cost of electricity to the consumer also goes way down on days when high wind power generation. Ireland's average wholesale price was about 72% lower as of compared to August of last year. But what's really interesting here are the changes going on behind the scenes. We've known for a very long time that renewables are the way of the future, but apparently Ireland has to not only catch up from an energy generation standpoint, but also in regards to their electrical grid. They've actually capped the amount of renewable energy their country can use to 75%. In other words, they generated more than 100% of their electricity from wind, but were still forced to use some fossil fuel sources and sell the excess clean energy to their neighbors. They claim that their old electrical grid, that was built around large, centralized power plants, it's not capable of handling the more widespread generative capabilities of having many wind-farmed or solar panels. To that end, the EU has suggested investing more than 500 billion per year in efforts to upgrade the grid itself, only the grid. But I don't know, I'm not an electrical engineer, but is the difference between centralized and decentralized power generation important enough to actively cap renewable energies? I guess it could lead to more stress on the system, but I guess that would just be a fast way of determining what requires replacement sooner. Regardless, congratulations to Ireland, who joins a very select list of countries that have ever generated more renewable energy than they required. You know, there's a lot of countries, especially in Europe, that really seem to be leaning into the opportunities that clean energy provide. Even Canada gets over 60% of their total electricity from renewables. but the U.S. is only a little over 20% right now. Think there's any reason for that?
Yeah, I don't know. Corruption. Probably, I'm
Probably.
guessing.
Fossil fuels are big. Canada's actually a larger exporter of natural gas than the United States also, but I guess they have a lot more hydroelectric up there, which helps them out a lot.
Guess so.
But renewable energies help in surprising ways too. This past summer was the hottest it's ever been, and there's every indication it'll never be that cool again. And there's actually a lot of evidence that renewable power helped the United States survive these hotter months, as reported by the NRDC of Chevron fame. The U.S. has had a history of power grid failures in recent years, but nationwide, this last summer had no significant heat-related outages. There's the notable exception of the Hawaiian fires, causing grid outages for some days, but that wasn't caused specifically from high climate heat. Actually, it seems that downed power lines caused by storm winds were the most likely cause of this Hawaiian fires. Yep. Anyways, it's a small victory that the U.S. has avoided a major energy shutdown this summer, especially in Texas. Several heat records were broken in Austin, Dallas, and El Paso, and with that came broken records in energy consumption as well. ERCOT, the Electrical Reliability Council of Texas, reported that this summer saw 10 all-time peak power demands. And of course, it's not only Texas that's hot. Most of the central United States electrical grid is handled by the Southwest Power Pool, based in Arkansas, and they too reported record heats and record high power usage. There's a couple reasons as to why the grid didn't fail. One is that, like previous years, ERCOT called their customers and begged them to use less electricity. Good job, Texas. You're really showing your independence and strength there. But the major reason is due to the addition of renewable energy and battery storage systems across the country. Many opponents of renewables have claimed that the attempt to add additional sources of energy would stress the grid beyond its capacity, especially in more fossil fuel-focused communities like in Texas. But it's a clear conclusion from the data that wind, and especially solar, was responsible for this energy stability. Dr. Joshua Rhodes at the University of Texas determined that the state produced twice as much solar power this year compared to last. And ERCOT reported that wind and solar generated up to 25% of total demand at peak hours. That's all set to continue too, as estimations suggest that by the end of this year, total solar capacity across the U.S. will have increased by 52% over 2022. This summer really showcased what our future summers should look like. Renewable energy sources have to continue or accelerate their growth. Battery storage has to get significantly better, and utility companies will have to come up with a better system of reducing peak demand than just hoping their customers will take rebates to stop consuming electricity.
Yeah.
But there's a lot left to improve too. Notably, there's the grid infrastructure itself, like our European neighbors. We're facing a slightly different problem than them. Since we have such a large country, it's been suggested that interregional transmission of energy is the area to focus on. That means mandating the capability of transferring something like 30% of electricity energy capacity between energy regions. We'll have to see if the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission will start enforcing that capability in the future. For our next story, as we sometimes do here, we've got a report on a report. Or to be a little more specific, we have TheGuardian.com talking about a recent propaganda piece by the right-wing think tank Civitas. The pamphlet, as originally published by Civitas, claimed that in the United Kingdoms, to achieve a net zero emissions electricity grid would cost 4.5 trillion British pounds. This is an absolutely wild figure that it was apparently the result of the author overestimating onshore wind power by a factor of 10,000. The actual cost, according to the Climate Change Committee of the UK, is closer to 1.4 trillion over the next 30 years, but also, as you'd expect, comes with over £1 trillion economy-wide savings on fossil fuel expenses. The real story here is how these think tanks operate. The messages they spread don't have to be factual, and usually aren't. When you have an organization that exists solely to support anti-scientific niche views, usually on behalf of wealthy investors or interests, they don't have to tell the truth. Civitas only cares if their numbers are incorrect once they're called out on it. They cherry-pick exactly the figures they want to present, such as citing a Faraday Institute report that automotive-related jobs could be lost in the transition away from fossil-fueled cars, and not including that the same report says more jobs could be created from the switch to electric vehicles. And right up until they're called out, they can keep peddling the narrative that fighting global warming is too expensive, or that our society doesn't have to take immediate and critical action in order to survive.
I think it does.
Yeah.
It seriously does.
This kind of anti-environmental drivel is not what we need. It's not what will lead us into a better future for humankind.
Yeah, when the grid starts to fail during a heat wave is when we're going to find out that, and we already know, but, that's going to be when the truth becomes inescapable. Let's escape it while we still have a head start. Why not?
Right. This think tank narrative came out after an announcement by United Kingdom Prime Minister Rishi Sunak back on September 20th. That's when he walked back many of the climate-related promises about UK environmental commitments, as reported by carbonbrief.org. Rishi Sunak is the leader of the Conservative Party and has served as Prime Minister since the whole fiasco with Boris Johnson and Liz Truss back in late 2022. And with the tide of public opinion in the UK turning firmly against the Tories, Sunak is desperate to force the trajectory of the government as conservative as he can get it before the next election. Many countries worldwide have been aiming for heavy environmental policy changes by 2030, but Sunak has pushed back by 5 years a ban on the sale of new internal combustion engine vehicles, and also loosened the constraints against fossil fuel heating and higher insulation standards. He calls it a new approach to tackling climate change based on sensible green leadership, and claims that people that want stronger climate policies are doing it no matter the cost or disruption to people's lives. In a roundabout way, he's right on that point. In order to save people's lives from climate disasters, we'll have to cause some disruption. But this kind of rhetoric is common with right-wing speakers. He's telling a nebulous half-truth in order to appear compassionate and reasonable. But the reality is we do have to change our entire society, and he's doing the public no favors in claiming to make the transition easier or slower. He's just indirectly causing more harm down the line. This is all doubly disappointing because the United Kingdom has made significant progress and created good initiatives towards their emission goals. Even Sunak himself in certain areas. Soon after taking office, he reinstated a ban on fracking that Liz Truss had removed. He's pledged millions to United Nations efforts against global warming, and especially to forest conservation back at COP27. And he has supported the United Kingdom's massive expansion of offshore wind farms. But this most recent speech is just a disheartening attempt at lying to the public for the chance to improve his popularity. One claim he made is that he's saving families from unacceptable costs, but by also loosening insulation requirements, he's costing renters £2 billion a year, according to an analysis by the UK Climate Change Committee. And by describing net zero policies as a, quote, burden, forcing tough choices and sacrifices, he's denying the reality that net zero practices represent a huge area of economic growth. All in all, this pushback by Sunak of the 2030 deadlines is just making the transition to a better world that much harder. The UK is already set to lag behind on its deadlines, and more action is required, not less. Our next story is a short but happy report from 13ABC News here in Toledo, Ohio. The Toledo Metro Parks Board has just approved the acquisition of 3 new properties to the Oak Openings Corridor.
Ah.
This corridor, as conceived of back in 2022, is an ongoing effort to connect many of the metro parks and nature preserves of the area together. From Oak Openings Preserve, it goes east across the Wabash Cannonball to the Cannonball Prairie Metro Park, and then all the way up north to Secor Metro Park, a distance of about 10 miles. This latest purchase is one of the last needed to make that dream of interconnectivity a reality. Metro Parks leaders say the new properties provide a new opportunity for preservation and restoration of the ecosystem. The Oak Openings Corridor already connects 4 parks with 3 nature preserves, and in the next few years, we should see a walkable, or maybe bikeable across that distance, trail that covers the same range. That'd be nice, I think, to have such a long hike across so many parks available to the public. Oak Openings especially is the largest metro park in the area and covers many different habitats: dunes, grassland, forests, of course, savanna. Have you been there?
I have been, yeah.
Yeah.
It's really wild. Like you're walking through this oak forest, and then suddenly you're on a beach surrounded with red sand, surrounded by oak trees with no water.
Yeah, it's crazy.
And it looks like incredibly alien, but really natural in the setting too. Somehow, both at once, you know.
It's a really hidden gem, and it's such an important habitat for studying the native Ohio species and habitats. Actually, this year, finishing sometime in the winter, they're going to try to restore some of the original Ohio wetlands by removing some of the pine trees they planted back there in the 50s.
Okay.
About a 7.7 acre area. I support the theory there, but I feel like that crosses the line between preservation and conservation, right? It's the Oak Openings Preserve, and that's the whole difference between preservation and conservation, where conservation, you maintain the ecosystem by taking action with it, whereas a preservation, you're supposed to leave it alone. I guess it's a gray area if the pines aren't native. They were planted there, but...
Well, I know up in Muskegon, there's a lot of pine. Michigan in general, because it tends to have sandy soil. So pines like sandy soil. So I see why they figured, okay, well, we feel like we need more trees here, so pine.
Right. Our last pair of stories deals with the non-cancerous health risks of radiation. Obviously, cancer is the most well-known consequence of radiation exposure apart from straight-up death. But as more attention and a larger spotlight is shown on nuclear power as a theoretical energy solution, a larger shadow is also being cast. It's been well known and expected that high-dose radiation can lead directly to heart or other organ failure. But back in March of this year, a meta-analysis of 93 studies covering a wide range of radiation exposure found a link between low-dose radiation and cardiovascular disease. The average rate of death from cardiovascular disease in the United States is about 25 out of every 100 people. For people exposed to 1 gray of radiation across their lifetime, this chance increases to between 27 to 29%, or more than a 2% higher rate. 1 gray of radiation is a large amount, most likely only people receiving radiation therapy and maybe nuclear industry workers would reach that level of exposure. But the researchers did also find consistent evidence for a higher rate of heart disease at lifetime doses less than 1/10 of a gray over both short and long-term exposures. The exact amount of health risk increase requires further analysis. What this does mean, as Dr. Andrew Einstein, senior author and nuclear cardiologist, says, quote, The effect of lower doses of radiation on the heart and blood vessels may have been underestimated in the past. This study suggests that the guidelines and standards for protection of workers exposed to radiation should be reconsidered, and efforts to ensure optima radiation protection of patients should be redoubled. That's quite similar language to when we reported on the in-work study a few weeks ago. Now, that study dealt with the heart. This next study links low doses of radiation to diabetes. At the annual meeting of the European Association for the Study of Diabetes in Hamburg this week, Doctors Huan Hu and Toshiteru Okubo presented the latest results of the Japanese National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health. Back in 2011, the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant tsunami disaster in Japan, apart from being an oft-forgotten terrible nuclear accident, provided a rare opportunity to study the health effects of radiation exposure. In 2014, an organization was created to track some 5,236 workers that were exposed during the emergency response. The initial levels of radiation exposure were all tracked individually from pocket dose meters and whole body counters assigned to each worker. From then through 2021, 10 years after the disaster, these workers underwent regular health examinations to determine any health effects stemming from the event. After adjusting for any other relevant factors, the analysis found that the incidence rate of diabetes in these workers was significantly higher as corresponding to the radiation each individual absorbed. The baseline they used was the diabetes rate of the individuals exposed to the least radiation, between 0 and 4 millisieverts, or comparable to the normal level of background radiation. If a worker was exposed to 5 to 9 millisieverts, their risk of developing diabetes was 6% higher. From 10 to 19 millisieverts and from 20 to 49 millisieverts, an incredible 47% and 33% higher rate was found. This is a remarkable finding, one that's really out of left field. This kind of link hasn't previously been found before, probably from the lack of subjects to study. To attempt to explain the phenomenon, Dr. Hu posits that the pancreatic cells responsible for insulin production may have been negatively affected, or perhaps a heightened level of inflammation resulting from radiation exposure accelerated the process of insulin resistance that leads to diabetes. The authors do note the findings are not without limitations. The participation of emergency workers in this health program is voluntary, comprising about 30% of the total workers present during the Fukushima disaster. They suggest the results could have a stronger correlation if the sample size was larger, but we hope that no opportunity like that will arrive soon.
That's interesting because, okay, I got diagnosed with diabetes after having COVID,
Okay.
which they say is related. And I know it's also related to weight, but I had actually been heavier than I was when I got diagnosed before and not had diabetes.
COVID might have produced inflammation if it's the same kind of thing that's
Right,
being
yeah.
reported on
yeah.
here. And I guess that already has a known incidence factor with diabetes.
Right.
I can't, I'm not a doctor, but the evidence continues to show, though, that radiation is not safe at any dose for your heart, your pancreas, your children, or for your life.
And also, I'm living Toledo is kind of surrounded by a nasty little fairy ring of nuke plants and refineries too.
It's not an extremely healthy place to live.
No.
But not many places are, unfortunately. Well, that brings us to the end of our show. A little bit of good news, some bad news, and a large amount of hope for a green future. You can always contact us at 419-973-5841 or email us at forgreenfutureradio@gmail.com with corrections, questions, or comments. And you can tune again in next week for more news, events, and cool stuff. Once again, I'm Joe DeMar.
And I'm Rebecca Wood.
And we'll catch you next time.
No. I don't want no oil spoiling my shoreline. I like fish much better than crud. I like birds and things, a green